Okay, imagine this for a second. You wake up, and everything that sort of connects you to your community, your past,
Hmm.
it's just faded. Like the songs, the festivals, the stories, gone. Sounds pretty dramatic, maybe even a bit sci-fi.
Yeah, almost apocalyptic in a cultural sense.
Right. But one of the sources we're looking at today kind of paints that picture, suggesting it's a real risk for communities worldwide. So we're doing a deep dive into this whole idea of traditional festivals and celebrations, well, disappearing. And the sources, we've got articles, some research bits. They don't just say, hey, this is happening. They argue it's causing some really significant problems, far-reaching ones.
Yeah, problems for cultures, societies, individuals.
Hmm.
It touches a lot.
Exactly. So our mission here is to unpack all that. We want to pull out the key insights from these sources. Why is this happening? What specific issues are they flagging? And maybe most importantly, what do they suggest we can actually do about it? How can these traditions be kept alive?
It's a crucial question.
I'm honestly really curious to get into the weeds here, understand the full impact, and what the sources really think is at stake.
And what's really striking is how the sources connect something that seems, relatively simple, like a local festival,
Yeah.
to these much bigger concepts. Identity, community cohesion, even things like economic stability in some cases. It's way more complex than just losing an old tradition or a party.
Okay, let's definitely unpack that. So when these sources talk about traditions vanishing, what are the big flashing red lights? What problems do they keep bringing up?
Well, almost across the board, the first thing they hit on is this really fundamental loss of identity and the sense of belonging that comes with it.
Identity.
Yeah.
How do they frame that?
They talk about culture like your language, your food, the celebrations, even your name as the actual fabric of who you are. It defines where you come from, shapes how you see the world. And these traditional events, the festivals and rituals, they're presented as incredibly powerful ways to build that sense of belonging. They connect people to their history, their ancestors, but also to each other right now.
Like a thread through time.
Exactly, a thread of continuity. So the insight isn't just, oh, we forgot an old song. It's that losing these things risks really disconnecting people from their roots, from what makes their community, well, unique.
Yeah.
And that leads directly into what a few sources specifically call cultural disintegration or erosion.
Erosion, like it just wears away.
Yeah. When that fabric starts to fray, especially if younger generations aren't really engaging with their heritage, maybe they aren't encouraged or just don't have the opportunity.
Yeah.
Then the culture itself starts to unravel. It fades.
Okay, and here's something that really jumped out at me from the sources. This idea that losing a festival or maybe a language
Yeah.
isn't just about sentiment. It's about losing actual practical knowledge. That sounds alarming.
It is, and the sources make a really strong case for this. Think about languages. They're so often tied directly to cultural practices. They
Yeah.
carry history, folklore, generations of wisdom.
Right.
So losing a language, it's way more than just losing words. It's losing a whole way of knowing, a whole history. And beyond language, there's traditional knowledge itself. Things like indigenous farming methods developed over centuries for sustainability, or traditional medicine that might have real value alongside modern healthcare.
Stuff that actually works.
Exactly. Time-tested, practical solutions.
Right.
When the culture fades, that knowledge often just vanishes.
Hmm.
Maybe forever. It's a huge potential loss.
Oh, okay. What else?
Another major concern is the threat to cultural diversity. We live in this increasingly globalized world, right?
Yeah.
And diversity should be a strength, something we value. But when unique local traditions disappear, it just contributes to this.
Mhm.
Homogenization. Everything starts to look and feel the same. It's an erasure of uniqueness.
And you mentioned economics earlier.
Yes, definitely. There are real economic threats highlighted. Think about cultural tourism. People travel specifically for those authentic local experiences, historical sites, traditional music, local food.
Yeah, I seek that out when I travel.
Right. So if those experiences disappear, that whole sector is undermined. And related to that, sources talk about local artisans, people making traditional crafts.
Mhm.
They find it incredibly hard to compete when cheap, mass-produced stuff is everywhere, so their livelihoods are threatened, and the craft itself might die out. And just briefly, a couple of sources did touch on even wider potential impacts, like the possibility that certain regions, maybe even specific religions, could struggle to maintain their distinct identity. And in some places, there was even mention of a risk to an official language declining if the cultural practices tied to it fade away.
Okay, so the ripple effects are potentially huge. From that very personal feeling of belonging all the way out to global diversity and, like you said, economic survival. So stepping back a bit, Why does preserving culture matter so much, according to these sources? What's the big picture takeaway on its importance?
They really argue strongly that preserving culture isn't just about, looking backwards or being nostalgic.
Right, not just museum pieces.
Exactly. They frame it as something that actively strengthens communities. It builds pride, unity based on that shared history, shared values. And maybe even more broadly, they suggest it helps build understanding and respect between different groups. In a world that's so interconnected, that kind of understanding can actually reduce prejudice, reduce division.
So it's about building bridges, too.
Yeah, building bridges, not just preserving artifacts. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, the problems are definitely clear and, frankly, quite sobering based on these sources. Let's shift gears, though. Why is this happening? What are the driving forces behind this decline? Strictly based on what the sources are telling us.
Well, the sources point pretty consistently to a few big interconnected drivers. Probably the most dominant ones are modernization and globalization.
The usual suspects, maybe?
Kinda, yeah. As cities grow, lifestyles change, the world gets smaller. There's this natural pull away from traditional ways that were often very tied to a specific local place and time. And globalization, I mean, it connects us, which is great in many ways, but it also brings this wave of dominant global pop culture.
You mean like Hollywood movie global brand?
Exactly. International films, fast food, global fashion, all that stuff can easily overshadow local traditions. It can dilute them, almost drown them out sometimes.
And technology plays a role in spreading that, I imagine.
It does. One source specifically calls out technology as having this dual role. It helps connect people, yes, but it's also the main vehicle for that global culture. So it contributes to how pervasive it is.
Makes sense. What else are they pointing to?
There's a really strong emphasis on younger generations and this generational gap.
Ah, okay. The kids these days
Right.
argument.
Sort of, but it's more nuanced in the sources. They do describe younger people sometimes moving away from their roots, maybe preferring modern life, or being more caught up in, say, social media trends than older customs. But, and this is crucial, some sources stress it's not always just about preference. Sometimes younger generations just aren't given the chance or the encouragement to actually engage with their heritage.
So it's not being passed down effectively.
Right. The elders, who are the keepers of so much of this knowledge, they might find that their kids or grandkids are less interested, or maybe just don't have the time in our busy world, or perhaps they don't see the relevance anymore.
And the economic factors you mentioned as a problem, did they also come up as a cause?
Yes, they reappear here too. Those traditional crafts and art forms, they often just can't compete economically. It's hard to make a living doing things the traditional way when mass-produced alternatives are so much cheaper, so people are forced to abandon those practices.
So practicality pushes people away too.
Definitely. And linked to that is just the sheer pace of modern life that gets mentioned too. People might feel they just don't have time for traditions that require, slow preparation or long celebrations.
High pressure. Yeah, I feel that.
And one other specific point in some areas, there's a clear preference emerging for non-local languages, like English, over the indigenous or local languages.
And those languages are tied to the culture.
Intrinsically tied. So if the language fades, the transmission of cultural knowledge gets much, much harder.
Yeah, the overall picture from the sources is that knowledge and practices that used to really define a community are sometimes just seen as outdated now or irrelevant in the face of global culture and modern demands.
That really does paint a picture of pressure from all sides, doesn't it? External global forces, internal shifts in society, economic realities. It's complex. So, okay, given these pretty significant problems and these powerful forces driving them, is there hope? What do the sources actually suggest can be done? What are the countermeasures? Thankfully, yes. The sources don't just leave us with the problems. They offer a whole range of steps, things that can be done. And they stress it needs effort on multiple levels. Maybe the most fundamental thing, the simplest but maybe the most powerful, is just to practice it and pass it down.
Live the culture, basically.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that the most direct way to keep culture alive is to actively live it. So parents, elders, making a real conscious effort, sharing the stories, the songs, the recipes, the customs with the next generation. And they also point to schools having a big role here. integrating cultural education into the curriculum, not as a dusty history lesson, but as a living part of learning.
Making it relevant to kids' lives today.
Precisely. And right alongside that is the call to celebrate and participate. Festivals, rituals, community gatherings, these aren't just shows for tourists.
They're the culture in action.
They're vital expressions. So supporting them, yes, but also actively joining in, participating, not just watching from the sidelines. That's what keeps them relevant and vibrant.
Okay, that makes sense. What about more practical day-to-day things?
Definitely. A very concrete step is to support local artisans and businesses. Make a conscious choice. Buy the handcrafted item instead of the mass-produced one. Choose the restaurant serving traditional food. Go to the local music or dance performance.
Putting your money where your mouth is, culturally speaking.
You could say that, yeah. It directly helps keep those cultural practices economically viable, allowing them to continue.
And the language point. If language is so key.
Then using and promoting indigenous or heritage languages is absolutely essential, according to the sources. Language is such a powerful marker of identity, a vessel carrying the culture. So they suggest encouraging its use at home, supporting initiatives that teach or revitalize endangered languages. Even just learning a few phrases yourself, if it's relevant to your area, can show support.
Right. Now, it's interesting. We talked about technology being part of the problem driving globalization. But I think I remember the sources saying it could also be part of the solution.
You're spot on, yes. While tech spreads global culture, the sources argue we can absolutely embrace digital tools for preservation too.
How so?
Think about online platforms, social media, digital archives. These are powerful ways to document cultural practices, share them widely, connect people across distances. One source had this really cool, specific idea: an app where elders could upload traditional knowledge stories, recipes, songs, creating this dynamic, living archive for younger generations to access.
That's a fascinating idea, using the tool that sometimes causes the problem to fix it.
Exactly, turning it around. And then finally, the sources stress the importance of the bigger picture, advocating for cultural policies.
So getting governments and institutions involved.
Yes, because individual actions are great, but systemic support makes a huge difference. This means supporting policies that protect heritage sites, provide funding for traditional arts, promote indigenous rights. Several sources mention governments needing to actually fund these kinds of activities. Making cultural preservation a real priority at the societal level, that has a much bigger impact.
Yeah, one source mentioned nations having a responsibility.
Yeah, that's right, that nations and people themselves are liable, responsible for maintaining awareness and supporting their cultural festivals and traditions.
Okay, so translating all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? If someone wants to help keep traditions alive, what can they actually do based on these source ideas?
Well, it really seems to boil down to getting involved, actively engaging.
It's not passive.
Not at all. It could be as simple as talking to an older relative about family history, you know, or trying to cook a traditional recipe from your background.
Or maybe seeking out a local cultural event and actually going, participating.
Exactly. Supporting that local artisan we talked about. Maybe learning a few words of a heritage language spoken nearby.
So these aren't just abstract ideas. They're concrete things people can do.
They really are. Actionable steps for individuals, families, communities. Right now.
So wrapping up this deep dive then.
Yeah.
It feels abundantly clear from everything we've discussed from these sources that culture isn't just some optional extra or a historical artifact.
No, it's fundamental.
It's dynamic, it's essential to who we are, how we connect, and its disappearance. The sources are pretty stark about the consequences. Real consequences from the very personal level right up to the global.
Cascading consequences, really.
Yeah. And the message seems to be that protecting it, promoting it, that responsibility doesn't just sit with governments or museums.
No, the sources put it on everyone. It lies with all of us.
And maybe the final thought to leave everyone with, something that really stuck with me from one of the sources.
What was that?
It said, essentially, once culture disappears, it's almost impossible to bring it back. Gone is gone.
Wow, that's stark.
It is. And they followed it up by saying, a world without culture. That's a world without color, without connection, without identity.
Definitely gives you something to think about.
It really does. Something worth reflecting on long after this.